Humanity has long sought salvation from without, an external hand to guide us, a redeemer to lift us from the shadows of our existence. Yet the psyche knows a truth that the conscious mind often resists. Nobody is coming to save you. To wait for deliverance is to remain in the prison of illusion, for the true liberation must emerge from within. The journey inward is both perilous and magnificent, for it demands that we confront the deepest recesses of our being. Your fears, your doubts, your unacknowledged desires, these are not obstacles to escape, but companions on the path of individuation. Every shadow you resist strengthens its dominion. Every unclaimed fragment of the self sows confusion in the psyche. To wait for external salvation is to deny your own capacity for transformation. You must become your own rescuer, your own guide, your own bearer of light in the dark. Do not underestimate the gravity of this responsibility. It is terrifying, for it confronts you with the rawness of your own being. But it is also exhilarating, for it is the only path to authenticity. The self is not something given, it is something earned through courage, insight, and relentless introspection. Only when you take the helm of your inner world can the chaos without begin to yield meaning. The call is not for comfort, but for awakening. The call is not for followers, but for explorers. The call is not for the faint of heart, but for the brave who dare to meet themselves fully, without masks or excuses. No one will fight your battles, face your shadows, or answer your questions for you. This is your voyage, and the currents of the unconscious will test you, refine you, and if you persist, elevate you. Stand now in the quiet of your own inner sanctum and hear the undeniable truth. Nobody is coming to save you. And in this truth lies liberation, for it demands of you a power and clarity that no external savior could ever bestow. To embrace your own agency is to awaken to life itself, raw, unyielding, and profoundly alive. To understand that salvation is internal, one must first confront the illusion that the outer world can provide the answers, can lift the veil of suffering, can fill the void that whispers within every human heart. From birth, we are conditioned to look outward, to seek guidance, to seek protection, to seek approval, to seek some external force that will lead us to safety, to success, to happiness. We are told that salvation will come through another, through parents, through teachers, through leaders, through companions, through institutions, and yet the psyche, in its infinite depth, knows a more ancient, more enduring truth, that no one outside of ourselves possesses the power to truly rescue us from the labyrinth of our own being. This is not to dismiss the value of community, friendship, mentorship, or love. These are vital aspects of the human experience, but they are shadows of salvation rather than its source. They may provide guidance, they may offer support, but they cannot illuminate the path within for us. That illumination is ours alone to discover. Each individual carries within themselves a realm as vast and mysterious as any ocean or cosmos, a world of memories, instincts, fears, desires, and dreams. Within this inner world lies the possibility of awakening, the seed of transformation, and the doorway to true liberation. Engaging one's own psyche is not a casual exercise. It is an undertaking of profound seriousness and courage. It demands that we become explorers of the unconscious, that we descend into the shadowed chambers of our own minds, where fear, shame, resentment, and unacknowledged impulses dwell. It is here, in these often terrifying corridors, that the psyche presents its most urgent lessons. The shadows are not enemies, they are messengers. They carry truths we have denied, feelings we have suppressed, parts of ourselves we have disowned. To ignore them is to invite chaos, to remain passive is to surrender agency, and to seek rescue from without is to live in a state of perpetual dependence and spiritual immaturity. True rescue comes when one recognizes that every encounter, every trial, every joy, every pain, every shadow that rises within the mind is an invitation to engage, to reflect, to integrate. This engagement is not intellectual alone, it is a matter of presence, attention, and deliberate confrontation with the entirety of oneself. One must listen to the whispers of the unconscious, for they speak in symbols, in dreams, in sensations, in fleeting thoughts that, if neglected, fade like smoke into nothingness. To engage is to bear witness to these inner stirrings, to sit in the discomfort of uncertainty, and to cultivate the courage necessary to see oneself without disguise, without rationalization, without evasion. In this engagement, the psyche reveals its paradoxical nature, that salvation and suffering are intertwined. One cannot bypass suffering and arrive at salvation, for suffering is the forge in which the self is tempered. Every wound, every failure, every moment of despair carries with it the potential for insight, for growth, for transcendence. When one faces these experiences consciously, when one refuses to project blame outward, and instead turns the gaze inward, the psyche begins to transform. It teaches that resilience is not bestowed by others. It is cultivated through conscious engagement, reflection, and integration of all aspects of the self. Moreover, the internal journey is not linear. It is cyclical, spiraling, iterative. One may think they have confronted a fear, only to find it re-emerging in a different guise. One may believe that understanding a shadow is sufficient, only to discover layers beneath it, deeper truths that require patience and courage. The external world may offer comfort or distraction, but it cannot substitute for the labor of the inner journey. The true rescuer, therefore, is not someone external but the self itself, awakened and willing to face its own depths. This awakening is the true gift of salvation. It is a realization that we are both the prisoner and the liberator, both the lost and the guide, both the darkness and the light. Consider the metaphor of a vast silent forest. To the uninitiated, it appears impenetrable, mysterious, even threatening. One might call for another to lead them through, to promise safety, to illuminate the path. Yet, no guide can navigate another's inner forest with the intimacy and precision required. Each path, each hidden glade, each shadowed grove must be discovered by the individual alone. The trees, the roots, the streams, the creatures of this forest are symbols of the psyche's content, and only by moving deliberately through them, by observing, learning, and integrating, can one reach the clearing at its center, the clearing where insight, clarity, and true transformation reside. Salvation as an internal process also involves the cultivation of self-reliance, not as a rejection of the world, but as the acknowledgement that reliance on others for ultimate deliverance is futile. True self-reliance is not arrogance or isolation. It is the recognition that the capacity to face life's complexities resides within, that the strength to endure, to transform, to create meaning is inherent, and that by turning inward, one awakens this latent potential. This does not negate vulnerability, it embraces it, but channels it constructively through reflection, understanding, and conscious engagement with the self. The engagement with one's own psyche is also a confrontation with temporality, mortality, and the impermanence of all things. The external world changes, decays, and often disappoints. To anchor salvation in external circumstances is to set oneself adrift in a sea without constancy. But the inner world, though complex and often turbulent, offers a constant source of truth and potentiality. It is the inner work that allows one to meet the inevitable uncertainties of life with resilience, wisdom, and serenity. Herein lies the ultimate lesson that freedom, clarity, and salvation are not gifts to be received, they are realities to be claimed through self-knowledge, courage, and the unwavering commitment to engage the psyche with honesty and devotion. One must understand that engaging the psyche is not merely a private or intellectual pursuit. It manifests in actions, decisions, relationships, and the way one perceives and interacts with the world. To know oneself is to act from authenticity, not from imitation or fear. It is to make choices rooted in insight rather than reaction, to form bonds that reflect genuine understanding rather than dependence, and to pursue goals that resonate with the soul rather than the superficial expectations of society. Salvation is, therefore, inseparable from the lived experience. It is internal, yet it radiates outward, transforming one's life in tangible ways. To conclude, the truth that salvation is internal demands both courage and humility. It requires the willingness to abandon illusions, to confront the unfamiliar landscapes within, and to recognize that no external hand will carry us through the labyrinth of our own consciousness. Yet, in embracing this reality, one discovers the power and beauty of the human spirit. The psyche, when engaged fully, becomes the instrument of liberation, the wellspring of meaning, and the path to authentic existence. True rescue is not an act performed by another. It is the unfolding of the self, through deliberate, conscious, courageous engagement with the depths of one's own being. In this engagement, we find not only survival, but transcendence, not only strength, but wisdom, and not only life, but the fullness of living. To speak of shadow confrontation is to speak of the inevitable journey into the hidden and often feared territories of the human psyche. Every human being carries within them an inner landscape that is largely uncharted, a complex network of impulses, desires, fears, and unresolved conflicts that remain in darkness because the conscious mind has chosen convenience over truth. The shadow, as it has been understood in psychological discourse, is not merely the sum of our faults or misdeeds. It is the repository of all that we deny, reject, or fail to recognize in ourselves. Growth, transformation, and the realization of the self demand that we enter this territory not as victims, not as spectators, but as brave explorers, willing to encounter the full spectrum of our inner reality. The shadow manifests in myriad forms. It may appear as fear that paralyzes us, preventing decisive action. It may emerge as self-doubt, whispering constantly that we are insufficient, incapable, or unworthy. It may arise as anger, jealousy, or resentment that blinds us to reality and distorts our relationships. Sometimes it takes subtler shapes, compulsions, unacknowledged desires, or persistent patterns of self-sabotage. These elements, if ignored, exert a silent power over our lives. They drive behaviors, shape perceptions, and create cycles of suffering that seem inescapable. To confront the shadow is not merely a psychological exercise, it is an existential necessity. One of the first lessons of shadow confrontation is that avoidance is the greatest obstacle to growth. The human psyche is adept at rationalization, projection, and distraction. We may blame circumstances, other people, or fate for our suffering, conveniently overlooking the contributions of our own unacknowledged patterns. Yet, the shadow refuses to be permanently hidden. It surfaces repeatedly, often in amplified forms, until it is acknowledged and integrated. Growth demands that we recognize this inevitability and cease the futile struggle against the self. Every avoidance is a postponement of liberation. Every evasion prolongs suffering. Facing the shadow requires honesty, of a rigor rarely demanded in ordinary life. It demands that we examine not only our actions but our intentions, not only our thoughts but the unconscious currents that shape them. It is not enough to identify superficial faults. One must probe the deeper, often uncomfortable truths that underlie behavior. This includes acknowledging envy, pride, fear, cruelty, dependency, or dishonesty, not to condemn oneself, but to recognize the full reality of the self. It is through such acknowledgement that one can begin to transform these latent forces into conscious energy, redirecting them toward growth and self-realization rather than allowing them to unconsciously dictate life. The process of shadow confrontation is profoundly challenging because it confronts the ego with aspects of the self it may reject. The ego, by its nature, seeks coherence, acceptance, and control. It desires a stable self-image and a narrative in which one appears competent, moral, and admirable. The shadow, in contrast, disrupts this narrative. It reveals contradiction, imperfections, and unintegrated impulses. encountering it often evokes fear, shame, guilt, or anger. These emotions are not obstacles, but signals, indicators of where transformation is needed. To flee from them is to remain imprisoned in the superficial self. To engage with them is to move toward wholeness. Shadow confrontation also requires patience and sustained effort. It is rarely a single dramatic encounter. It is a lifelong engagement. Shadows recur, evolve, and adapt, appearing in new forms as we grow. What is integrated today may re-emerge tomorrow under stress, fatigue, or temptation. Therefore, shadow work is not a temporary task, but a continuous commitment to self-awareness, reflection, and integration. It demands vigilance, humility, and the willingness to confront the uncomfortable truth that no matter how much one develops externally, the inner work is never fully complete. Integration of the shadow does not imply suppression or annihilation. On the contrary, it is a process of recognition, acceptance, and redirection. By acknowledging the shadow, one transforms reactive energy into conscious power. Fear can become discernment. Anger can become assertiveness. Envy can become inspiration. Destructive impulses can be harnessed creatively. The shadow, once integrated, becomes a wellspring of vitality, creativity, and insight. Growth is achieved not by eliminating the shadow, but by befriending it, learning from it, and allowing it to inform conscious action without dictating it unconsciously. Moreover, shadow confrontation is inseparable from the broader path of individuation. Individuation is the process by which a person becomes an integrated, authentic self, a self that is aware of its own contradictions and harmonizes them into a coherent whole. The shadow is central to this process. One cannot achieve wholeness while ignoring the aspects of the past, yet that remain in darkness. Indeed, the shadow is the gateway to profound self-knowledge, revealing not only weaknesses but also latent potential, creativity, and depth. To confront the shadow is to confront the full spectrum of humanity within oneself, with all its contradictions, mysteries, and power. The practice of shadow confrontation can take many forms. Reflection, journaling, dream analysis, active imagination, meditation, and therapy are all means of engaging the unconscious. Each offers a unique avenue for dialogue with the shadow, providing insight into the patterns that shape life and revealing paths toward transformation. These practices demand courage and consistency. They require that one turn inward regularly, observe without judgment, and confront what arises with clarity and resolve. Finally, shadow confrontation has profound implications for one's relationships and engagement with the world. The aspects of ourselves we deny often manifest as projections onto others. By recognizing and integrating these shadows, we diminish the unconscious tendencies to blame, manipulate, or attack external reality. We become more compassionate, more discerning, and more authentic. We engage with the world from a place of awareness rather than reaction, choice rather than compulsion, love rather than fear. Growth, therefore, is not merely personal, it radiates outward, transforming the spaces and lives with which we interact. In sum, shadow confrontation is both the challenge and the gateway of human growth. It is the call to face the fears, doubts, and hidden aspects of ourselves with courage, honesty, and persistence. It is the recognition that the path to wholeness requires entering the dark, unfamiliar chambers of the psyche, engaging with the unconscious, and integrating its messages into conscious life. Only through this engagement does true growth occur. Only through this confrontation does the self achieve the depth, resilience, and wisdom necessary to navigate the complexities of existence. To meet one's shadow is to meet oneself fully, and in that meeting lies the profound possibility of transformation, liberation, and authentic life. To speak of authenticity is to speak of the most fundamental and yet most elusive dimension of human existence. Authenticity is not a casual adherence to personal preference or whim. It is the alignment of one's conscious life with the deeper currents of the psyche, with the innermost truths that define the self. It is the unmasking of the superficial persona, the stripping away of borrowed identities, and the courageous assertion of one's being in a world that constantly pressures conformity, distraction, and denial. But authenticity is not a gift bestowed by society, nor a state attained by accident. It demands responsibility for one's thoughts, emotions, impulses, choices, and the subtle, often hidden aspects of one's inner world. Responsibility in this sense is not a mere social or moral obligation. It is a profound psychological imperative. It requires that the individual recognize their own role in shaping experience, both internal and external, and cease to defer power to circumstance, habit, or the influence of others. To live authentically is to understand that the life we experience is a direct reflection of the inner life we cultivate. Every perception, every emotion, every action originates ultimately in the self. To abdicate responsibility is to surrender authenticity. To claim responsibility is to reclaim the right to live fully. This engagement with inner life begins with self-awareness. Awareness is the light that illuminates the hidden recesses of the psyche, revealing the motivations, fears, desires, and contradictions that govern behavior. Without awareness, one drifts in the currents of unconscious patterns, swept along by habit, projection, or societal expectation. Responsibility begins with the recognition of this unconscious influence. It requires that we examine not only our decisions, but the underlying drives that shape them, not only our actions, but the unspoken narratives that inform them. Every thought entertained, every feeling acknowledged, every impulse observed becomes a locus of responsibility. Authenticity further requires the courage to confront dissonance between the inner and outer worlds. Many individuals live with a persistent disjunction between who they are and the roles they perform. They assume masks to satisfy external expectations, to gain approval, or to avoid conflict. The persona becomes a fortress, protecting the ego but imprisoning the soul. Responsibility demands that one interrogate this dissonance, to ask where one is acting from genuine conviction and where one is acting from fear, habit, or compliance. To live authentically is to realign outer action with inner truth, even when it is inconvenient, even when it invites risk, even when it challenges the comfort of familiarity. Moreover, authenticity is inseparable from the integration of the shadow. The shadow, the collection of disowned, denied, or hidden aspects of the self, cannot be ignored if one seeks full responsibility. To claim responsibility for one's life is to acknowledge these hidden elements, to observe their influence without denial, and to consciously integrate them into the wholeness of the self. The unexamined shadow exerts subtle control over behavior, often undermining authenticity through projection, avoidance, and repetition of unconscious patterns. Responsibility requires that one face these shadows, not with self-recrimination, but with discernment, acceptance, and deliberate effort toward integration. Living authentically also demands the mastery of choice. Every day presents innumerable opportunities to act in ways that either affirm the self or betray it. Responsibility is exercised in these choices, both grand and subtle. It is expressed in the decision to speak truth rather than appease, to embrace discomfort rather than evade, to pursue growth rather than stagnation. Choice is the mechanism through which inner life manifests externally. Authenticity is the outcome when choices consistently reflect inner truth. To evade choice is to surrender authenticity. To embrace it is to exercise sovereignty over one's own existence. This responsibility is not only individual, but relational. Authenticity requires that one take ownership of the effects one's inner life has upon others. Every interaction, every relationship, every influence we exert originates from the inner self. If the inner life is unexamined, projections, insecurities, and unconscious drives shape relationships in ways that may cause harm. Taking responsibility for one's inner life includes observing the ways one affects others, acknowledging the consequences of words and actions, and striving to act from conscious alignment rather than reactive habit. Authenticity, therefore, is both a personal and an ethical commitment. It binds the self to the dual imperatives of truth and conscious influence. Furthermore, embracing responsibility for one's inner life requires the cultivation of resilience. Life inevitably presents suffering, loss, disappointment, and conflict. To live authentically in the face of these realities requires the recognition that external circumstances do not define the self. The inner life must be the anchor, the reference point, and the source of clarity. Resilience emerges from the disciplined attention to one's own psyche, from the deliberate engagement with thoughts, emotions, and impulses, and from the willingness to respond consciously rather than react unconsciously. Responsibility, in this sense, is inseparable from psychological strength. Authenticity also demands the acceptance of imperfection. Responsibility is not perfectionism, it is honesty and courage. One must recognize limitations, acknowledge errors, and accept the ongoing nature of growth. To evade responsibility under the guise of inadequacy is to remain inauthentic. Conversely, to embrace responsibility with humility is to affirm the self's capacity for learning, adaptation, and genuine alignment with inner truth. The journey toward authenticity is a lifelong endeavor, marked by recurring reflection, self-correction, and recommitment to inner alignment. The cultivation of inner life through responsibility also fosters creativity, insight, and originality. When the psyche is engaged consciously, energy previously dissipated in avoidance, denial, or projection becomes available for conscious creation. Thoughts, ideas, and actions emerge that are not dictated by fear or conformity, but are expressions of the self's unique potential. Authenticity, therefore, is not merely the alignment of being, it is the unleashing of latent capacities, the transformation of inner life into meaningful, outwardly expressed contributions. In addition, authenticity grounded in responsibility cultivates profound freedom. Many mistake freedom as the mere absence of constraint or the indulgence of desire. True freedom is the ability to act from one's own center, informed by self-knowledge, guided by conscious intention, and uncoursed by unconscious impulses or societal pressure. Responsibility is the key to this freedom. Without responsibility, one remains a puppet of circumstance and habit. With responsibility, one becomes the master of choice, the architect of experience, and the sovereign of one's one life. Ultimately, authenticity and responsibility are inseparable. To live authentically is to accept the weight of one's inner life, to navigate the currents of thought, emotion, and unconscious influence with courage and clarity, and to allow conscious engagement to shape behavior, relationships, and destiny. It is a lifelong commitment, demanding vigilance, humility, and courage. It is the recognition that no external authority, no circumstance, no relationship can bestow authenticity. It is claimed only by the individual through deliberate, sustained attention to the self. In conclusion, the path of authenticity is the path of responsibility. It requires courage to observe, humility to acknowledge, discernment to act, and perseverance to maintain alignment with the self across the vicissitudes of life. Only by taking charge of one's inner life, by confronting fear, desire, and shadow with honesty, and by translating inner alignment into conscious choice, can one live fully. Authenticity is not a destination but a practice, a continual engagement with the richness, complexity, and depth of one's own psyche. It is through this engagement that the human being attains not only self-realization, but the profound joy, freedom, and fulfillment that constitute a fully lived life. To speak of the self is to speak of that elusive, radiant center of consciousness around which the entirety of human life orbits. The self is not a casual accumulation of traits, achievements, or social roles. It is the profound totality of the psyche, encompassing the conscious, the unconscious, the known, the hidden, and all that lies in between. It is the archetypal goal toward which life inexorably moves, the endpoint of the journey of individuation, and yet it is never given as a gift. The self is earned, it is realized through the deliberate engagement of the human being with the depths of their own being, through courage in the face of the unknown, through insight that pierces the veil of illusion, and through reflection that illuminates the patterns, choices, and shadows that shape existence. Individuation, the process through which the self is realized, is perhaps the most profound undertaking of human life. It is a path without shortcuts, a labor without guarantee, and a journey that demands both patience and audacity. The psyche does not surrender its deepest truths to the passive seeker. It responds only to those who actively engage, who dare to confront fear, who explore the darkness within with both respect and discernment. To await the self externally, to hope for salvation, guidance, or revelation without inward effort, is to remain in perpetual incompleteness. The self is a horizon that moves toward the traveler only when the traveler moves toward it with deliberate intention. Courage is the first pillar of this realization. The path to the self is strewn with uncertainty, confrontation, and what may appear to be insurmountable challenges. One must confront not only the external vicissitudes of life, but the internal forces that resist transformation. Fear manifests in countless guises: fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of insight, fear of change. The courage required is not mere absence of fear, but the steadfast willingness to move forward despite it. It is the courage to encounter the shadow, to witness one's own imperfections, to sit with pain and ambiguity, and to act despite the trembling of the psyche. Without this courage, the journey stalls. The self remains concealed, waiting patiently, waiting to brave the inner unknown. Insight is the second pillar. Courage alone is insufficient if it is unguided. The path toward individuation requires discernment, a capacity to perceive patterns, to recognize projections, to distinguish between the voice of the ego and the guidance of the unconscious. Insight emerges from sustained attention, from reflection upon experience, from the interpretation of dreams, symbols, and inner stirrings that reveal the hidden architecture of the psyche. To seek insight is to cultivate an internal map of one's own being, to illuminate the corridors of thought, feeling, and impulse that dictate unconscious behavior. It is through insight that one begins to navigate life consciously, rather than reactively, aligning decisions with the totality of the self rather than fragments or illusions. Reflection is the third pillar. Individuation is not a linear or purely cognitive process. It requires a sustained and disciplined engagement with oneself. Reflection is the practice of turning the gaze inward, examining not only what is evident, but what lurks beneath awareness. It is the examination of motives, desires, conflicts, fears, and aspirations. Reflection allows the individual to perceive where the persona obscures the self, where projection distorts perception, and where avoidance inhibits growth. In reflection, the seeker pauses, contemplates, and integrates experience, transforming it from mere occurrence into wisdom. Without reflection, insight remains fleeting, courage becomes reckless, and individuation stalls in the superficial layers of personality rather than reaching the profound depth of the self. The self is earned through the synthesis of courage, insight, and reflection into lived experience. It is in the daily choices, the persistent attention to inner life, and the deliberate confrontation with both comfort and discomfort that individuation unfolds. The journey requires patience, for the psyche reveals itself gradually, layer by layer, as the seeker demonstrates readiness, sincerity, and endurance. It is a process of accretion rather than in revelation, a gradual accumulation of awareness, integration, and authentic engagement with the totality of the self. Moreover, earning the self necessitates engagement with the shadow. The unacknowledged, rejected, or denied aspects of the psyche exert an unconscious influence that shapes behavior, perception, and relationships. To ignore the shadow is to invite illusion and fragmentation. To confront it is to reclaim energy, insight, and wholeness. Shadow work is not a peripheral activity, but central to the attainment of the self. Each confrontation with fear, each acknowledgement of denial, each integration of a hidden aspect is a step toward wholeness. In this labor, courage is tested, insight deepens, and reflection becomes more nuanced, creating a dynamic interplay that gradually reveals the self. The self is also earned through the mastery of internal conflicts. The human psyche is not harmonious by default. It is a field of contradictions, competing desires, and latent tensions. Individuation requires that these tensions be recognized, understood, and synthesized. The seeker must discern which elements reflect the true self, which are the products of conditioning, which are the echoes of societal imposition, and which are the echoes of societal imposition, and which are the distortions of fear or repression. Through this discernment, the self emerges not as an abstract ideal, but as a living integrated reality, a conscious center capable of guiding action, perceiving truth, and sustaining resilience. Earning the self also requires embracing responsibility. One cannot achieve individuation while surrendering agency to circumstance, habit, or other people. The realization of the self demands full engagement with the consequences of one's choices, the cultivation of deliberate action, and the acknowledgement that life's trajectory is shaped by conscious participation. Responsibility is not punishment or obligation. It is the acknowledgement that the self has the power to shape its own reality. It is through this responsibility that the self becomes embodied, fully present, and capable of authentic expression. Furthermore, the attainment of the self is inseparable from the recognition of interconnectedness. Individuation does not imply isolation. It is not solipsistic. Rather, the self, once realized, perceives its relation to the collective, to the world, and to the archetypal patterns that underlie human experience. The earned self carries not only personal authority but the wisdom to navigate relational and societal dynamics with integrity, insight, and compassion. In this way, individuation transcends egoic ambition, aligning personal wholeness with ethical engagement and meaningful contribution to the broader human context. The process of earning the self is ongoing. There is no final point at which one may claim completion. The psyche evolves continuously, presenting new challenges, layers, and depths as life unfolds. Courage, insight, and reflection must therefore remain constant companions, guiding the seeker through successive stages of understanding and integration. The earned self is thus dynamic, responsive, and alive, an evolving center of consciousness capable of accommodating growth, complexity, and the inevitability of change. In sum, the self is not given, it is earned. It is the product of courageous engagement with the unknown, of insight that pierces illusion, and of reflection that integrates experience into coherent understanding. It is forged through shadow confrontation, through disciplined attention to internal conflict, and through the exercise of responsibility and agency. It emerges gradually, layer by layer, as the individual persists in deliberate conscious engagement with the totality of the psyche. To earn the self is to participate fully in life, to embrace both suffering and joy, and to cultivate a conscious, authentic presence in the world. The earned self is the culmination of a life lived with awareness, courage, and integrity. It is the realization that no external authority can bestow wholeness, that no circumstance can substitute for engagement, and that the deepest fulfillment arises not from the world, but from the conscious mastery of one's inner domain. Individuation is a labor of love, a disciplined journey, and a continuous unfolding that transforms the seeker into a sovereign presence, complete, resilient, and profoundly alive. To speak of empowerment through solitude is to speak of a truth often overlooked in the noise and distraction of human society. Modern life presents countless avenues of connection, communication, and external validation, yet in these very networks, the individual risks losing touch with the profound and inexhaustible resource that resides within, the self. Solitude is not merely the absence of others, It is the conscious turning inward, the deliberate engagement with one's inner world, the willingness to confront the unmediated reality of one's thoughts, emotions, and consciousness. In solitude, the self is no longer a reflection of collective expectation or external approval, but a living, autonomous entity capable of introspection, discernment, and deliberate growth. The journey into solitude begins with acknowledgement. Many fear solitude because it exposes the unadorned self. When stripped of external distractions, social masks, and habitual diversions, the individual encounters both brilliance and darkness within. This confrontation is often unsettling, for it reveals unacknowledged impulses, insecurities, desires, and conflicts that have been projected outward or ignored. Yet, it is precisely within this confrontation that empowerment emerges. To endure and engage with one's inner reality is to cultivate a strength unassailable by circumstance, unshaken by opinion, and unbound by the fleeting currents of social approval. Solitude serves as both mirror and forge. It reflects the totality of the psyche, revealing patterns, contradictions, and unconscious influences that otherwise remain hidden. Simultaneously, it tempers the individual like a crucible that purifies raw material. In this space, one practices self-reliance, learning to respond to internal stimuli with conscious awareness rather than automatic reaction. One learns to cultivate discernment, to choose action in alignment with inner truth rather than external compulsion, and to harness emotional, mental, and spiritual energy toward deliberate ends. Here, empowerment is not granted, it is claimed through consistent, disciplined engagement with the self. The solitude of self-reliance also fosters authenticity. In the absence of external influence, one discovers the difference between the persona and the self, the difference between borrowed values and intrinsic truth. Many live lives dictated by societal expectation, cultural norms, or relational dependency, yet in solitude, these constructs are stripped away and the self is revealed in its raw, unmediated form. It is in this revelation that one discovers what is genuinely meaningful, what aligns with one's deepest convictions, and what resonates with the inner compass of the psyche. Authentic empowerment cannot exist without this clarity. Moreover, solitude cultivates resilience. Life inevitably confronts the individual with trials, uncertainty, and suffering. When one has developed the capacity to dwell in solitude, one has also developed the capacity to withstand adversity. External support may falter, circumstance may betray expectation, yet the individual anchored in self-reliance finds strength in the constancy of their inner world. Solitude nurtures a well of inner resources that can be drawn upon in moments of crisis, providing clarity, courage, and composure. In essence, it is through solitude that one becomes self-sufficient, not in isolation, but in the awareness that one's power originates within and is not contingent on circumstance or others' validation. Engaging with solitude is, however, not a retreat into escapism or narcissism. It is not the pursuit of detachment from reality, but the conscious creation of a space in which the self can be observed, understood, and integrated. It allows the individual to confront the shadow, to reflect upon desires and fears, and to cultivate the faculties of insight and discernment. In solitude, one wrestles with the unconscious forces that shape perception and behavior, translating hidden energies into conscious knowledge and deliberate action. In this way, solitude is both a laboratory and a sanctuary, a place where inner life is cultivated with care and where empowerment is forged through conscious engagement. The empowerment discovered in solitude is not passive, it radiates outward into life. It transforms relationships, decisions, and actions, for one who has cultivated inner strength is no longer reactive to the vicissitudes of circumstance. One engages with the world from a place of centeredness, clarity, and deliberate intention. Choices are made with awareness rather than compulsion. Interactions are guided by insight rather than fear or habit. In solitude, the self learns to act with sovereignty, to assert boundaries with integrity, and to pursue purpose with resilience and authenticity. Moreover, solitude fosters creativity and vision. In the absence of constant external distraction, the mind is free to wander, to explore, to imagine, and to synthesize. Ideas emerge that are not derivative of collective thou, but are rooted in the originality of the self. The individual in solitude discovers depths of insight, imagination, and innovation that remain inaccessible in the perpetual din of external influence. Here, empowerment is intertwined with creativity, for the self, fully engaged with its inner resources, becomes a source of generative energy capable of shaping both personal destiny and contribution to the wider world. Empowerment through solitude also cultivates a deepened sense of responsibility. When the self is experienced as the primary agent of one's life, the individual recognizes that choices, actions, and consequences originate from within. External blame, excuses, or avoidance become insufficient frameworks, for the self has become the locus of accountability. Responsibility and empowerment thus become inseparable. To cultivate self-reliance is to acknowledge one's role in shaping one's inner and outer reality, and to act with integrity in accordance with that awareness. Furthermore, solitude allows for the development of discernment in relation to social and collective forces. By cultivating a self-sufficient inner life, one gains the capacity to engage with society from strength rather than dependency, from understanding rather than compulsion. One can participate in collective life with clarity, choosing relationships, alliances, and endeavors that resonate with authentic purpose. Solitude, therefore, does not alienate. It informs interaction, guiding the self toward engagement that is deliberate, meaningful, and aligned with inner truth. The transformative power of solitude is evident throughout human history, reflected in the lives of mystics, philosophers, artists, and thinkers. Those who have achieved profound insight, creativity, or spiritual realization often cite periods of isolation as the crucible in which their inner faculties were honed. It is in these solitary engagements that the self is discovered, strength is cultivated, and life is approached with deliberate intentionality. Solitude is not a luxury. It is a necessity for the cultivation of depth, authenticity, and power. In conclusion, empowerment through solitude is the cultivation of self-reliance, inner clarity, and authentic strength. It requires courage to face the unmediated self, reflection to understand inner dynamics, and disciplined engagement to translate insight into action. In solitude, one encounters the full spectrum of the psyche, light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, desire and fear, and learns to navigate it with wisdom and agency. True empowerment emerges not from external validation, support, or circumstance, but from the deliberate development of the inner self. The individual who embraces solitude discovers reserves of strength, clarity, creativity, and resilience that are inaccessible through dependence on others. In solitude, one learns that the truest power resides within, waiting to be claimed through conscious engagement with the depths of one's own being. In the end, the journey of the human psyche is not a simple path marked by external achievements, social approval, or fleeting moments of pleasure. The path that leads to wholeness, to individuation, and to authentic power is invariably inward. The self is neither given nor discovered by chance. It is earned painstakingly through courage, reflection, and the relentless engagement with one's own inner reality. Every step along this path demands that we confront what we have avoided, acknowledge what we have denied, and integrate what we have fragmented within ourselves. There is no substitute for this labor, no shortcut that the psyche allows, and no savior who will intervene. In this truth lies both the terrifying weight and the liberating promise of existence. A body is coming to save you, yet within this stark reality, the opportunity for profound empowerment and freedom emerges. The first requirement of this work is courage, the courage to face the self unflinchingly. Within each of us reside forces both luminous and shadowed, energies that inspire creation and impulses that threaten destruction. To traverse the terrain of the psyche is to encounter fear, doubt, and the unacknowledged impulses that reside in the unconscious. Fear will arise as the mind protests confrontation, doubt will emerge as the ego resists discomfort, the shadow will assert itself through projection, compulsion, and repetition. These are not obstacles to the path, they are the path. Each confrontation, each acknowledgement, each integration of a hidden element is a brick in the foundation of the self. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the willingness to engage, to endure, and to act in alignment with inner truth, despite fear's insistence. Reflection is the second pillar, the mirror through which insight is gained. To reflect is to turn the gaze inward with honesty, patience, and discernment. Reflection allows one to see the currents beneath the surface of thought and behavior, to perceive the patterns that shape life, and to recognize the interplay of persona and shadow. Through reflection, the illusions of external authority, social expectation, and unexamined habit are revealed. One comes to understand that authentic power does not come from conforming, pleasing, or avoiding responsibility, but from deliberate engagement with one's own inner dynamics. Reflection is both discipline and art. It requires attentiveness, subtlety, and the willingness to endure the truths that are often uncomfortable. Insight follows naturally from reflection. The illuminated mind, informed by deliberate contemplation and careful observation of inner life, begin as to discern the underlying architecture of the psyche. Insight reveals the unconscious influences that shape behavior, the hidden motives that distort perception, and the latent potentials that have been ignored or suppressed. These revelations are not mere intellectual curiosities, they are practical guides to living. Insight transforms fear into understanding, impulsivity into intentionality, and fragmentation into coherence. It is through insight that one begins to navigate life not reactively, but consciously, with clarity and integrity. Solitude is the arena in which courage, reflection, and insight are practiced and perfected. In solitude, the distractions of society, the demands of others, and the clamor of external approval fall away, leaving the individual face to face with the self. This encounter is both difficult and liberating. It reveals both strength and vulnerability, both the brilliance and the shadows that reside within. Solitude allows the self to become the primary point of reference, the anchor in which power, clarity, and authenticity are cultivated. Here, one discovers that the deepest reservoir of strength is internal. It does not depend on circumstance validation or support, but on the disciplined engagement with the inner life. Shadow confrontation is inseparable from this process. To engage with the shadow is to encounter those aspects of the psyche that have been denied, projected, or repressed. It is to recognize the impulses, fears, and desires that the conscious mind resists, and to integrate them into a coherent whole. Shadow work is not pleasant. It is often uncomfortable, disorienting, and even painful, yet it is indispensable. The shadow holds not only the sources of conflict, but also hidden potential, creativity, and energy. To ignore it is to remain fragmented. To confront and integrate, it is to move toward wholeness, resilience, and authentic power. Authenticity, then, is the natural outcome of courage, reflection, insight, solitude, and shadow integration. It is the alignment of external action with internal truth, the harmonization of persona with self, and the conscious expression of one's deepest convictions. Authenticity is not achieved once and for all. It is a living practice, an ongoing engagement with the self, continually tested by circumstance, challenge, and relational dynamics. To live authentically is to claim responsibility for one's life, to act deliberately rather than reactively, and to embrace the entirety of the self with honesty and courage. Responsibility itself is not external, it is internal, rooted in the recognition that life is the mirror of the inner world. Every choice, every action, every response is an expression of the psyche. To abdicate responsibility is to surrender authenticity and empowerment. To embrace it is to claim sovereignty over one's own existence. Responsibility and freedom are inseparable. The more one takes ownership of the inner life, the greater the capacity to act freely, consciously, and purposefully. True empowerment is thus inseparable from responsibility. It is a function of self-reliance, integrity, and the deliberate cultivation of inner strength. Individuation, the realization of the self, is the culmination of all these processes. It is not a reward, a gift, or an external attainment. It is earned through consistent, courageous engagement with the inner life. It requires the integration of light and shadow, the harmonization of desire and discipline, the alignment of inner truth with outer action, and the cultivation of conscious choice in every moment. Individuation is a lifelong labor, for the psyche continually evolves, presenting new challenges, shadows, and opportunities for growth. The earned self is resilient, authentic, and capable of navigating the complexities of existence with wisdom, courage, and integrity. In this final understanding lies the ultimate liberation, the recognition that nobody is coming to save you, yet in this truth lies infinite possibility. Empowerment, authenticity, insight, courage, and wholeness are not bestowed from without. They arise from deliberate, disciplined engagement with the depths of one's own being. To claim them is to become the master of one's inner life, the author of one's own destiny, and the sovereign of one's existence. In solitude, reflection, and confrontation with the shadow, the self discovers its truest strength. In responsibility, alignment, and deliberate choice, the self is realized and expressed. And in this realization, the human being moves from fragmentation to wholeness, from fear to courage, from dependency to sovereignty, and from superficial existence to authentic life. The journey does not end, for the psyche is inexhaustible in its depth and complexity. Yet the labor of self-engagement, the courage to confront and integrate, the discipline of reflection, the clarity of insight, and the cultivation of solitude together constitute the path to ultimate empowerment. The self, once earned, becomes a living center of consciousness, capable of sustaining resilience, fostering creativity, and guiding purposeful action. It is a source of freedom, authenticity, and strength that no external force can diminish. Thus, the final truth emerges. The human being is both architect and inhabitant of the inner world. The path to wholeness, individuation, and empowerment is not offered, but earned. It is not given, but claimed through courage, insight, reflection, and deliberate engagement with the self. The shadows that once threatened coherence become allies. The solitude that once seemed isolating becomes a sanctuary. The challenges that once induced fear become catalysts for growth. In embracing responsibility, in seeking authenticity, and in cultivating the inner life, the individual discovers that the self is not only attainable, but inexhaustibly alive, radiant, and powerful. In this ultimate integration, the human being realizes that the self, once earned, is the foundation of all true strength, freedom, and fulfillment. It is the foundation of all true strength, freedom, and authenticity flow, the inner compass that guides action, choice, and engagement with the world, and the eternal witness to the unfolding of consciousness across the vicissitudes of life. To embrace this path is to embrace the full responsibility of existence, to claim sovereignty over one's own destiny, and to live fully, profoundly, and authentically, in accordance with the deepest truths of the psyche. This is the final affirmation. Your strength is within, your guidance is internal, your salvation is your own. Nobody is coming to save you, yet in claiming your inner life, in engaging with your shadow, in embracing solitude, and in cultivating reflection and insight, you become the self, the indivisible, authentic, empowered, and radiant center of conscious existence. It is here, in the depths of your one being, that life's truest power, freedom, and fulfillment are realized, not as gifts, but as the natural fruit of your courage, responsibility, and unwavering engagement with the self. Thanks for waging